Every country on Earth is in debt. Together, they owe more than $300 trillion. That's over 3 times what the entire planet produces in a year. But here's the twist. This mountain of debt didn't just happen. It was built on purpose. And if you trace the system far enough back, you end up in one place, London, 1694. One man, one law, and one idea that changed the world. What if debt never had to be paid back? That single question gave birth to the Bank of England, and with it, the first financial system designed so governments could borrow forever. By the late 1600s, England was broke. King William III was locked in an expensive war with France. The treasury was empty. Credit was dead. Just a few decades earlier, King Charles II had pulled the ultimate betrayal, the great stop of the exchequer. He simply stopped paying back loans to his creditors. That one act shattered trust in public finance. Now, no one wanted to lend to the crown again. Into this chaos stepped William Paterson, a Scottish merchant banker with a radical proposal. Instead of the king borrowing ad hoc and defaulting whenever he pleased, what if a bank lent to the government instead? Not for one war, not for 1 year, but forever. The birth of the Bank of England. In 1694, Parliament granted Paterson's idea a royal charter. The newly formed Bank of England raised £1.2 million in just 12 days from around 1,200 subscribers, then lent the entire sum to the government at 8% interest, plus a management fee. But here's the kicker. The loan didn't have to be repaid, ever. The government only had to pay the interest year after year, generation after generation. That deal created something the world had never seen before: perpetual debt. Economists later called it a consol, a government bond with no maturity date, paying interest forever unless the government decided to redeem it. In practice, that meant this. Every year, taxpayers sent money to the government. The government sent that money to the bank and bondholders. And the principal, the actual debt, stayed untouched. The old promise of "we'll pay this back" turned into "we'll pay interest on this forever." For the first time in history, the state tied its future tax revenues to private creditors permanently. It gave governments a powerful incentive to keep borrowing because they never actually had to pay it off. Why this mattered for ordinary people. Imagine you're a Londoner in 1700. War taxes keep climbing. Prices rise. The government keeps borrowing more from the bank. Every coin you pay in taxes, a slice of it, goes not to build roads or fund schools, but to pay interest to investors you'll never meet. Without realizing it, the average citizen becomes part of a financial machine that feeds itself endlessly. Over time, the Bank of England became the government's banker, its note issuer, and its debt manager. The Crown's finances and private capital were now inseparable. The state would borrow, private investors would lend, and the public would pay. There was no final payoff, only perpetual obligation. Here's where the tension builds. Once debt becomes perpetual, there are only 2 outcomes. You keep paying the interest forever, or you collapse. The system was never designed to be repaid. It was designed to be maintained. And that's the genius and the curse of Paterson's invention. From 1694 onward, the machinery of modern debt was in motion. A system where nations could fight endless wars, fund vast empires, and never run out of credit because repayment was no longer the point. The world's first permanent debt economy had begun. And 3 centuries later, we're all still living inside it. The Napoleonic Wars had left Europe wrecked. Nations were buried under impossible debts. Taxes couldn't keep up. Armies needed pay. Empires needed rebuilding. The entire continent was running on borrowed money. Into this chaos stepped a family that would quietly rewrite the rules of global finance, the Rothschilds. 5 brothers, 5 cities, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. Each handled their city's markets, but they moved as one machine connected through coded letters, private couriers, and trust that blood could guarantee. They didn't just lend money, they moved it. They created the first true international financial network, able to shift gold and credit across borders faster than any army could move. It was a system so fast and so reliable that even kings started relying on it more than their own treasuries. In London, Nathan Rothschild became the family's strategist. He wasn't interested in lending for interest alone, he wanted control. His breakthrough was turning government debt itself into a marketable product. Before the Rothschilds, governments borrowed, paid interest, and defaulted whenever things got bad. Lenders took the hit. Nathan changed that. He started buying government bonds at steep discounts, then selling them to investors at a markup. It seems simple, but it changed everything. He had created a secondary market, a place where government IOUs could be bought and sold like goods. For the first time, government debt became liquid. The results were powerful and dangerous. Governments got the money they needed right away. Investors got assets they could trade. The Rothschilds made profit in between. But here's what almost no one realized. This system made default practically impossible. If one government stopped paying, it would ripple through every bondholder, every bank, every investor in Europe. No ruler could afford that kind of chaos. The Rothschilds had turned sovereign debt into a network of mutual dependence, a web that no one could escape. Control wasn't just about capital. It was also about information. In 1815, during the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild received news of Napoleon's defeat hours before the British government did. He moved instantly. First, he sold British bonds, creating panic that Britain had lost. Prices collapsed. Then, when the market bottomed out, he quietly bought everything he could. The next day, official word of victory spread and bond prices soared. That single move made him a legend. He had used knowledge, not muscle, to bend the market to his will. But while the Rothschilds grew richer, ordinary people bore the weight. Taxes rose to pay interest. Wages stagnated. Entire nations labored just to service the debt that financed their own wars. Farmers in France, merchants in London, craftsmen in Vienna, all of them, unknowingly, worked to feed a financial machine they couldn't see. By the 1820s, the Rothschilds controlled the public debts of Europe. No government could borrow large sums without their involvement. They didn't rule nations, but they could decide which ones stood or fell. That's real power. Their system relied on three core forces. Credit. Governments could borrow endlessly, and paying interest became a permanent obligation. Liquidity. Bonds could be traded anywhere, anytime, turning debt into a global currency. Information. Knowing what others didn't allowed the Rothschilds to move first, profit most, and influence everything. Default wasn't just a national issue anymore. It was a continental threat. Any country refusing to pay risked dragging down everyone connected to its debt. The system itself enforced obedience. The Rothschilds had perfected control without armies. Wars continued. Empires expanded. Economies boomed and crashed. But at the top, nothing changed. Money kept flowing upward. By the mid-1800s, a new power was rising: America. It had land, ambition, and resources, but not yet a sophisticated banking system. American leaders watched Europe's debt machine carefully. Alexander Hamilton and others studied how the Rothschilds and the Bank of England had stabilized credit through permanent borrowing. They wanted the benefits, growth, liquidity, credibility, but didn't recognize the trap. Once you build a system where debt never dies, it begins to own you. Europe had already learned that lesson. Now, America was preparing to expand it, and in the next century, one man would weaponize that model on a scale the world had never seen. His name was J.P. Morgan. America at the turn of the 20th century looked unstoppable. Railroads crisscrossed the nation. Factories poured out steel, oil, and ambition. Cities rose higher every year. But beneath the boom was a secret weakness. The financial system was primitive. Money was tied to gold. Banks were local. And debt, it stopped at the city limits. Until one man, J.P. Morgan, decided to rewrite the rules of money itself. The Panic of 1907. October 1907. The market cracked. Stocks collapsed. Banks began to fail one by one. Depositors rushed in panic, demanding their money back. Cash vanished. Trust evaporated. The entire economy teetered on the edge of ruin. Then, in the middle of the storm, one man took control. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, summoned the heads of the nation's largest banks into his private library. He locked the doors and he didn't let them out until they agreed to pool their capital to stop the bleeding. Within days, the panic ended. The market stabilized, confidence returned. Morgan didn't just save a few banks. He saved the system itself and became a national hero. But he also saw the flaw no one else could fix. America's entire economy depended on one old man's intervention. That wasn't sustainable. He needed a structure permanent, invisible, and above politics that could do what he had done that night in his library. 3 years later, in 1910, Morgan's circle met in secret. Not in New York, not in Washington. On a private island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. For 9 days, behind closed doors, they drafted the plan for a new central bank. Publicly, it would look democratic. 12 regional banks. A board of governors appointed by the president. Checks, balances, independence, everything the public wanted to hear. But privately, it was something else entirely. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be owned by private banks, the same banks they were meant to regulate. Those banks elected the boards. The boards influenced the Fed itself. And at the top, real power sat in New York in Morgan's network. The most revolutionary idea? The Fed could create money out of nothing to buy government bonds. That meant two things. The US government would never run out of buyers for its debt, and private banks would always earn interest from the money created. The United States had just invented a system of infinite debt, and very few people understood what that meant. How debt became infinite before the Fed, borrowing had natural limits. Banks could only lend what gold they actually had. When credit dried up, the system stopped. But after the Fed, the limits disappeared. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created dollars. The government spends that money. Debt grows, interest flows, and the cycle repeats forever. The machine didn't just allow debt, it required it. Without constant borrowing, the money supply would shrink, markets would crash, and the illusion of stability would fall apart. Morgan hadn't just stopped a panic. He had built a mechanism where debt had to exist permanently for the system to survive. The human consequence. Most Americans never saw JP Morgan's library or heard about Jekyll Island, but they lived inside the machine it created. Taxes rose not to build or repair, but to pay interest. Prices shifted with every policy the Fed made. Booms and busts were no longer natural, they were engineered. The Federal Reserve became a safety net for banks, but a leash for everyone else. The mechanism was quiet, invisible, and impossible to escape. In 1913, the year the Fed was born, U.S. federal debt stood around $2.7 billion. Today, it's over $38 trillion, all following the same logic Morgan built. Debt never disappears. Interest never stops. And the machine never sleeps. Morgan's system didn't stay in America. It became the template for the modern world. Central banks, government bonds, permanent debt markets, all interconnected. Now, wars could be funded endlessly. Crises could be managed without ever truly resolving them. Governments became perpetual borrowers. Banks became the permanent beneficiaries. And citizens the silent guarantors. That's the elegance of the design. Control without visibility. Power without accountability. It was brilliant. It was efficient. And it was inescapable. Paterson built the engine of permanent debt. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. By 1913, the architecture was complete. The U.S. could borrow forever. The world could never default cleanly. And the gears were locked in motion, ensuring that every crisis, every war, every bailout, every stimulus would keep the same system alive. J.P. Morgan didn't just stabilize a panic. He engineered a structure that made crisis itself profitable and debt eternal. The trap was now global, and the next chapter would reveal how it became political. By the late 1970s, the global economy was breaking down. Inflation in the US surged past 10%. Oil shocks sent prices through the roof. And confidence in the dollar, the foundation of global finance, began to crumble. The system that Paterson built, Rothschild globalized, and Morgan perfected was hitting its limits. The machine needed a new operator, someone ruthless enough to reset it. That man was Paul Volcker. The inflation crisis, 1,979 inflation in America, was spinning out of control. Unemployment was climbing. Interest rates were rising, but not fast enough to stop the panic. Foreign governments were losing faith in the dollar. If the dollar fell, the entire post-war financial system, trade, banking, global debt could collapse. So Volcker did the unthinkable. He raised the federal funds rate from 11% to 20%, the sharpest monetary shock in American history. Almost overnight, inflation crashed. The dollar stabilized. And Wall Street cheered. But outside the US, Volcker's move triggered an earthquake. The global debt explosion. Throughout the 1,970, developing nations had borrowed billions in cheap US dollars. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they were promised growth and modernization. Then, interest rates tripled. Those debts turned toxic overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil, $60 billion. Argentina, $40 billion. Their interest payments alone exceeded what they earned from exports. If these countries defaulted, American banks would go down with them. The global financial system, all built around the dollar, could implode. So Volcker did what Morgan once did in 1907. He orchestrated a rescue. But this time, it wouldn't just save the banks, it would enslave nations. The lifeline came through the International Monetary Fund. It offered loans to countries drowning in debt, but the terms were brutal. Governments had to cut public spending, sell state-owned industries, devalue their currencies, open their markets to foreign capital. Debt was never forgiven. It was restructured, rolled over, extended, but never erased. Interest payments kept flowing. The system didn't collapse. It evolved, tightening its control over the developing world. For ordinary people, the cost was catastrophic. In Mexico, food prices soared while wages froze. In Brazil, factories closed and unemployment spiked. In Argentina, schools and hospitals lost funding as poverty deepened. Every austerity plan was sold as reform, but the result was always the same. A nation's sovereignty traded for survival. And the money? It flowed upward to the same creditors, the same banks, the same system. Decade after decade, the cycle repeated. Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2010, Sri Lanka in 2022. Different names, same playbook. The IMF keeps the debtor nations paying. The debt never disappears. The system never loosens. Volcker's brilliance wasn't just economic, it was strategic. Before him, debt was a national problem. After him, it became a global weapon. If a country couldn't pay, it had to comply, sell assets, follow reforms, accept policy oversight from Washington and Wall Street. Debt became leverage, a way to shape economies and governments without firing a single shot. Volcker turned money itself into a tool of influence. He made the system inescapable. Paterson built permanent debt. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it unavoidable. By the mid-1980, the structure was complete. Developed nations borrowed and refinanced endlessly. Developing nations borrowed, defaulted, and surrendered sovereignty. Creditors collected interest, profit, and power. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. Paul Volcker died in 2019, but his design still runs the world. Every government lives under the same law. Borrow, pay interest, roll over the debt, never default. Because default isn't just failure, it's systemic collapse. Debt isn't a problem to solve. It's a tool to control. And interest is the rent we pay to live inside the system. By the end of the Volcker era, the architecture was global, automated, and self-reinforcing. The debt trap was complete. And the next evolution, digitizing money itself, would make escape nearly impossible. Imagine a system where debt isn't just ink on paper. It's code lines of logic running through servers, satellites, and trading terminals. A world where governments borrow trillions with a keystroke. Where central banks create money out of nothing, instantly, endlessly. And where default isn't forbidden by law, it's forbidden by math. This is the final evolution of the debt trap, the digital one. The financial collapse of 2008. The global financial system imploded. Lehman Brothers vanished overnight. Credit markets froze. The entire machine built over centuries stood seconds from total collapse. Then came the rescue. Not by governments, by central banks. The Federal Reserve hit a button and created money electronically, quantitative easing. Trillions of dollars appeared to buy government bonds, mortgage securities, anything to keep the system breathing. This wasn't a one-time bailout. It was a transformation. Debt stopped being limited by cash, gold, or paper. It became digital, infinite, self-reinforcing. Central banks, the new debt machines. Before 2008, the Fed printed money to calm panics. After 2008, it printed money as policy. The Fed bought trillions in US bonds and promised there was no limit. The European Central Bank followed with sovereign debt purchases. The Bank of Japan took it further, pushing interest rates below zero and experimenting with digital monetary policy. Money creation became an algorithm. Interest payments never stopped. Principal repayment no longer mattered. Debt became a permanent operating system. Digital debt doesn't sit in servers, it flows through lives. Your pension? Invested in government bonds. Your insurance? Tied to debt markets. Your taxes? Paying interest to the system that creates more of it. When the government borrows, you're the collateral. Even when it cuts spending or raises taxes, the math doesn't change, debt still grows faster than repayment. Interest keeps flowing upward, and no one votes on it. The role of AI and automation. Now, machines run the markets. Algorithms decide which countries can borrow, how much, and at what rate. AI models assess national credit risk in real time. Trades move across continents in milliseconds. No one's in charge. The system adjusts itself automatically to protect the flow of interest. If a nation's risk rises, AI tightens credit. If inflation spikes, it pulls liquidity. The goal is simple: keep the machine stable, even if it means squeezing entire economies to do it. The US debt stands above $38 trillion. Roughly half of it is held inside its own system, the Fed, pensions, and asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard. Every dollar borrowed becomes a digital asset, traded, leveraged, replicated. If America ever tried to pay it off, those digital dollars would vanish. The system would implode, deflation, collapse, contagion. So repayment isn't an option. It's a mathematical impossibility. And the same holds true for Japan, Europe, China. Every central bank, every bond market, every digital ledger, all wired into the same feedback loop. A single network, a single failure point. Paterson built permanent debt. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable. And now, central banks, asset managers, and algorithms have made it autonomous. QE and negative interest rates turned money into software. Asset managers consolidated power, holding entire nations' debts. AI enforces market stability faster than humans can think. The debt trap no longer needs bankers in suits. It runs itself, unseen, unchecked, unstoppable. From gold coins in 1694 to AI-managed bonds in 2025, the design never changed, only the interface did. Debt is permanent. Debt is global. Debt is infinite. Debt is automated. Every interest payment flows upward. Every crisis strengthens the network. Every nation lives inside it. Debt is no longer a policy. It's a code self-executing, self-enforcing, and self-preserving. The digital age didn't destroy the debt system. It perfected it. The machine no longer needs consent. It just needs connectivity. The global debt machine isn't invisible. It's right in front of us, hidden behind layers of institutions, algorithms, and acronyms. And at the top, a handful of firms that quietly control tens of trillions of dollars. They don't build factories, they don't fight wars, they don't innovate, they own, and they collect endlessly. The rise of mega asset managers. Since the 1980s, the game changed. Governments borrowed, central banks printed, debt exploded. But someone had to hold that debt, not citizens, not governments. A new class emerged, the mega asset managers. BlackRock over $10 trillion under management. Vanguard over $8 trillion. State Street around $4 trillion. Add Fidelity and a few others, and together they control more than half of all global assets. These aren't banks. They're the middlemen between your paycheck and the debt markets. pensions, retirement funds, insurance premiums, all funneled into the same system. When the US issues treasury bonds, they buy them with your money. You don't see it, but you fund it. America's debt, $38 trillion. Every year, over $1 trillion in interest flows from taxpayers straight to bondholders. Who are the bondholders? Mostly the same institutions that already manage everyone's savings. $18 trillion of US debt is owed internally to Social Security, Medicare, and government accounts. Another chunk is owned by the Fed itself, created from digital dollars. The rest is spread among global investors, funds run by BlackRock, Vanguard, and their peers. Globally, it's the same pattern. Japan owes $9 trillion. Europe, $14 trillion. China, roughly the same, all financed through interconnected banks and funds. It's circular by design. Everyone owes everyone, but the interest always flows upward. How wealth consolidates, these mega managers don't just own markets. They move them. They decide which bonds are safe. They trade billions in microseconds. They influence how much governments can borrow and at what cost. They have direct lines to central banks, regulators, and finance ministries. Their size alone makes them system critical, too big to challenge, too integrated to fail. Every bailout, every rate cut, every new debt issuance pushes money toward them. It's not corruption. It's the design. Wealth doesn't just concentrate. It compounds upward. Workers produce. Governments tax. Asset managers collect. The invisible tax, they call it debt service. But make no mistake, it's a tax. A transfer of wealth from the many to the few. Teachers, nurses, small business owners, their taxes fund interest payments. Those payments flow to funds owned by the ultra-wealthy. The principal never shrinks. The interest never stops. It's the largest continuous wealth transfer in human history, quiet, legal, and built into the system. The network is global and tight. Japan buys U.S. bonds. The U.S. supports European debt through IMF channels. Europe holds the developing world's loans through the World Bank. Every node feeds another. Every government must borrow to survive. Every citizen must pay to sustain it. The structure guarantees control. Borrowing isn't a choice, it's the oxygen of modern economies. And the air is owned. For the few at the top, it's yield. For everyone else, it's pressure. Wages lag. Pensions shrink. Living costs climb. And still, the system demands more interest. Governments slash services to meet payments. People work longer for less. The machine keeps spinning, perfectly efficient, perfectly extractive. Mega asset managers sit at the center, not as villains, but as the logical product of centuries of financial evolution. They don't control countries by decree. They do it by owning the debt. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable. The digital age made it automatic. And the mega asset managers made it profitable. Every payment you make, every bond issued, every tax dollar collected flows upward, and it never stops. The system isn't malfunctioning. It's operating exactly as designed. This is the modern debt machine, global, digital, and permanently tilted toward those who already own it.